Welcome to Within the Frame, where we delve into the most up-to-date issues across the globe. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The 2024 U.S. presidential election is just around the corner. With less than 20 days until voters head to the polls, the race is heating up in key battleground states. Democrat Kamala Harris seems to have erased Republican Donald Trump's lead over President Joe Biden since announcing her candidacy on July 21st. Survey results have been neck and neck lately. Trump gained the lead over Harris in Fox News poll released Wednesday that found him up 50% to 48%. Meanwhile, a different poll by an Economist YouGov shows Harris with a 4-point lead. So which key aspects could sway the hearts of the voters, and how do the candidates' policies differ in terms of economy and diplomacy? For answers to this, we're joined in the studio by Min Jung-hoon, professor at Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Good evening.
And also joining us online is VOA correspondent Chris Casquejo. Good to have you, Chris.
Good to be with you.
So, Chris, let's begin our discussion. With just less than 20 days, until the U.S. presidential election, can you tell us what's the current state of the race in key battleground states, and how is sentiment among voters being analyzed?
New swing state polls out Wednesday suggest that the race remains very close before Election Day. Former President Donald Trump leads Vice President Kamala Harris by 7 points in Georgia, while Harris has a 2-point advantage in North Carolina, according to Quinnipiac University. Polls also show a very tight race in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, with Harris holding slight leads in each, but within the margin of error. In the Quinnipiac poll, likely voters were asked who they think would do a better job handling the economy, immigration, and Trump received an advantage in that aspect of the poll, while on abortion, Harris was favored by voters. Now, voters in the states were split on who would do better on preserving democracy in the U.S., with Georgia, the majority of voters in Georgia saying Trump would do a better job of preserving democracy, while 51% of voters in North Carolina said that Harris would do a better job of preserving democracy.
Now, Chris, what strategies are both candidates employing to solidify their support bases and expand their appeal to moderate voters? And how would you evaluate them?
Well, last week we saw an effort from the Harris campaign to shore up her support among women. She appeared on The View and the popular podcast Call Her Daddy, while Trump tried to shore up his support with men last week, appearing on podcasts, gaming platforms, and alongside surrogates who really emphasized manliness. He's really courting the male vote, and that really highlights the gender gap, with the majority of women backing VP Harris and majority of men backing former President Donald Trump. Now, this week, Harris looked to broaden her outreach to GOP voters skeptical of Trump. She sat down for an interview with Fox News anchor Bret Baier, where the two had a long, tense exchange over immigration. But Harris notably said to Baier, "My presidency will not be a continuation of Joe Biden's presidency," which was a change from earlier interviews where she had said she couldn't think of anything she'd do differently than Biden. Now, Trump, for his part, answered questions from undecided Hispanic voters on the Univision network, but he once again repeated his false claim that the 2020 election was stolen. And when asked about the January 6th Capitol riots in 2021, he said it was a day of love from the standpoint of millions.
And now to Professor Min, how do you assess the effectiveness of the strategies being implemented by both candidates?
As you know, the President Biden dropped out of the race, and Vice President Harris became the Democratic nominee. But even after the presidential race changed to Harris versus Trump, the Democratic and the Republican parties' presidential campaign strategies or frames are still maintained. It's mainly because it's virtually impossible to fundamentally change the direction of the election campaign. Only about 100 days left until the election day. So the Harris is emphasizing the achievements of the Bidenomics, the Biden government's economic achievements, while claiming that former President Trump is a threat to democracy and unfit for the presidency. Meanwhile, Trump is highlighting the Biden government's policy failures, such as high inflation and cost of living and the southern border crisis, and the President Trump's America First policy as an alternative. And instead, a new point, attack point, has been added, taking into account the new competition between Harris and Trump. So specifically, the Vice President Harris, her background as a lawyer, non-white woman, 59 years old, so relatively younger than the President Trump, is being used to highlight her differences from Trump, and Harris' emphasis on prosecutor versus defendants or criminal, and supporting abortion rights versus opposing abortion rights, and future versus the past. In response, Trump is increasing his criticism on Harris by branding her as the number 2 person in the Biden government and extreme, progressive, or liberal. Specifically, Trump is attacking Harris as a terrible and incompetent border czar and highlighting that she's responsible for the Biden government's failure to govern. And he's also criticizing Harris' policy directions by arguing that Marxist District Attorney Harris' California socialism, it will destroy the American dream. So I think that both candidates' campaign strategies or the frames are working to mobilize their own supporters, but it's not clear or certain which strategy would be working better to embrace swing voters or late deciders in the battleground stage.
Right. So we'll have to wait and see until the next 2-3 weeks coming. Then, Professor, you've mentioned about their strategies. Can you give us a brief landscape of how the sentiment among voters is analyzed at this moment? How are the voters? What is the state of the race at now?
With the negative competition, as you know. And of course, the opinion polls showed that nationwide, the Harris is leading the Trump like 1 or 2 percentage points is within a margin of error. But if we go a little bit deeper into the 7 swing states, then we can see the total difference, a little bit different story. Probably a week ago, until a week ago, the Harris got a little bit the lead among the Rust Belt states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, like the 1 or 2% lead. But the situation is changing. So Trump is leading in those states, less than 1%. And meanwhile, in the 4 sun states, like the Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada, the Trump continues to lead the Harris like the 1 or 2 percentage points in those the southern states. So it means that among the 7 swing states, Trump got some kind of lead against Harris. So if the race continues until the election day, then it is very likely that Trump would win the election. But still, we still left about 20 days before the election day. We will see how the voting intentions in those 7 key swing states would change.
Right.
Like a little bit leaning toward the Harris again, or just the Trump.
Right.
We'll see.
We'll see. Some analysts, Professor Min, suggest that the decline in support for Harris among traditional Democratic voter bases like Black and Hispanic voters. How would you read into this potential shift in sentiment despite Trump's immigration policies?
Well, basically, we will actually see what the choice those traditional Democratic voters will make on election day. But anyway, it's not a good sign. It's not a good signal for Harris anyway at this point of time. As you know, American politics is extremely polarized. And it is very important to mobilize traditional voters, supporters, and make them come out to vote for the party candidate on election day in order to win the election. And just to go back to the 2016 presidential election, Hillary Clinton lost the election, and studies show that losing about 5 to 7% of votes from Black and Hispanic voters at that time, like compared to the 4 years ago, Barack Obama in 2012, significantly affected her defeat. And as you mentioned, it is reported that Harris is losing some support from Black and Hispanic voters, especially male voters. And an opinion poll showed specifically that just 78% of Black voters support Harris, while 90% of those voters sent their support for Biden in 2020. 12-point difference for the Black voter support. And the Black male voters, just 70% of them support Harris, but about 85% of those Black male voters voted for Biden in 2020. And likewise, the poll showed that only 56% of Hispanic voters support Harris, but 62%, like a 6% difference, 62% of those voters voted for Biden in 2020. And 70% of those voters voted for Obama in 2008. So again, it's not still certain, clear if Black and Hispanic voters actually increase their support for Trump on election day this year. But it is also very likely that if Harris does not fully receive their votes this November election day, especially in the major battleground states or the swing states, it could not be easy to win those states.
Right.
Huge difference.
So we see a general decline in favor of Democrats, right?
Yeah, but there's a possibility that those Black and Hispanic voters just did recover their support for Harris on election day. At this point in time, they just express their uncertainty or disappointment and a little bit grievance against Harris because they may think that they did not receive the full care or the policy, the promises from the Democratic voters, but there's just the possibility that those voters just show their loyalty on election day. We will see.
There's still room for changes. Now, Chris, early voting began in Georgia October 15th, and on the 17th will be North Carolina. Chris, can you tell us about the current trends in early voting and public opinion?
Yeah, early voting is going well in both of those states. In Georgia, more than 10% of expected turnout of 6 million cast ballots Wednesday. So around 600,000 ballots have been cast in Georgia so far. And both Democrats and Republicans try to drive their most committed partisans to vote early in Georgia so they can focus later, moving toward the actual election day, towards the more reliable voters. Now, in North Carolina, turnout for early in-person voting started strong Thursday, including in the mountainous areas where Hurricane Helene hit. More than 400 early voting sites opened as scheduled for the 17-day period in North Carolina, including all but 4 of the 80 sites previously anticipated for the hardest hit counties in the western part of the state hit by that storm.
Right. Like you've mentioned, a huge number of people showed up for early voting rate, and over 320,000 voters participated in Georgia on the very first day of early voting. What factors do you think are driving this high turnout?
Well, first of all, there's been some changes in voting rules in Georgia. It's now harder this year to vote by mail in that state. Voters must physically sign an absentee ballot application, and counties are required to mail them later. And the number of drop boxes in North Carolina has been sharply limited. That's all combined to decrease mail ballot requests since 2020, which was part of a hotly disputed series of changes to the election rules in that state. And it's also a change from 2020 when, amid the pandemic, Georgia temporarily made it easier to request a mail ballot online and set up many drop boxes. But it's a lot different this year, mainly because we're no longer in the COVID pandemic.
Right. So it's also about feasibility of how you vote. Now, Professor Min, it's generally believed that high early voting rates could be a sign that it's a favor for Democrats. Do you think this trend will persist in this highly contested election?
Well, we need to see what actually happened on election day. But the early voting is very important to decide which candidate would win the election. And as Chris mentioned, early voting has begun in several states, and it seems that turnout is high in the early voting. For example, as Harris mentioned, early voting has begun recently in North Carolina, where many counties were seriously damaged by the Hurricane Helen. But in those counties, turnout is very high, and although they are very busy recovering from the damage. And just going back to the 2020 president election, at the time, about 70% of voters nationwide cast the ballots by early voting. Of course, the turnout in early voting this year is expected to be a little bit lower than 4 years ago because the 4 years ago, in terms of the COVID-19, it was easy for the voters to come out to vote on election day. Instead, they chose casting the votes in terms of the early voting, like a mail vote. And as you mentioned, it is known that Democratic voters tended to vote more than Republicans in early voting. So, generally speaking, high early voting this year could favor the Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, but there could be a still possibility that many Republicans also would cast their ballots in early voting. It's mainly because the Republican National Committee and the Trump camps encourage Republican voters to vote early this year because they realized that about 70%. So many of the voters cast their ballots by the early voting in 2020. So we need to see actually which party voters actually voted voted more early. Anyway, turnout in early voting this year will significantly affect which party would be more successful in terms of mobilizing their party voters, and those kind of efforts and the turnout in the early voting will significantly affect which party candidate would actually win the election this year.
Right, so the results of the early elections would be a key in seeing the outcome. Now, Chris, let's delve into some policies. Economic issues have emerged as a crucial factor influencing voter decision. What is the current public sentiment regarding economic policies?
That's one of the current areas where Trump has enjoyed an advantage throughout this race, whether it was Biden as the candidate or Harris as the candidate. Voters have generally favored him on the economy, and in a survey released by Bankrate on Tuesday, 42% of Americans said Trump would be a better choice for their personal finances and inflation, while 45% of those polled said he'd be best for the economy. By contrast, 38% of respondents said that Harris would be a better choice for their personal finances. 40% of those polled also backed her on the economy, and 39% said she'd be the best candidate on inflation. Conversely, the Wall Street Journal released a survey showing economists expected higher inflation, national deficits, and higher interest rates under Trump's proposed economic agenda than under policies proposed by Vice President Harris.
Right. Now, let's talk about economic cooperation with South Korea now. Professor, How do the candidates plan to address the trade agreements with South Korea? What changes would be anticipated depending on the outcome of the election?
Well, on the one hand, for the candidate Harris, there has been little comments or the speech about the trade agreements between South Korea and U.S. So I expect that there would be a little change in terms of managing or the changing trade agreements between the two countries under the Harris the government, if Harris wins the election. But if President Trump, former President Trump, gets reelected, a aggressive ROK-US relationship based on his transaction-oriented alliance view and America First trade policy. And those views would be expected to be revived or restored or emerged. Though specifically President Trump's transaction-oriented alliance view is expected to be emerged as a political rhetoric on the economic aspects of alliance operation, such as the burden sharing, ROK-US joint military exercises, and the deployment of the strategic asset to the Korean Peninsula. And the trade policy of the Trump second government will consist of a protectionist approach to reduce U.S. trade deficit against South Korea. There will be no distinction between allies and the non-allies in the Trump's political effort to reduce the U.S. trade deficit. So the trade barriers on South Korea's export to the United States are expected to be increased because South Korea is one of the countries with a trade surplus with the United States. So South Korean government need to prepare for the higher trade barriers under the second Trump government.
Right. We have a lot more questions on various topics prepared, but I'm afraid we're running out of time. We'll have to wrap up our discussion here. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights tonight, Chris.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. And also, Professor Min, we appreciate it.
Thank you. Good night.
Now, that wraps up our program for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Korea time. Hope you have a great weekend.